In this discussion, we're going to address global governance and international organizations by focusing on the United Nations. The idea of global order and global politics is an ideal that has existed for centuries, but in the modern period mostly revolved around the sovereignty of states, following traditional international theorists who see sovereignty as the only existing order. Global governance, however, also involves non state or transnational actors in the realm of what Lawson calls global civil society, reflecting broader social movements with global orientation. Governance arrangements are also evident in the trend toward regionalization, which began with the end of World War II. We discuss these matters here, along with the domestic challenges that also feed justification for global governance. Regarding global governance and the UN's role in global governance, we see the UN as more or less a replacement for the League of Nations, and the UN is seen as an improvement in that it began with a larger number of players. All but 9 of the original members were from other parts of the world than the United States or Western Europe, making it more global from the start. UN membership itself has grown to be synonymous with statehood. Original membership in 1945 was 41 members, but it grew to 159 by 1984, and today it has reached 193, with the latest state to be added being South Sudan in 2011. 2 non-member states include the Holy See and Palestine, who hold observer status. The designers of the UN attempted to devise a stronger system of global governance with greater capacity for collective security in order to overcome the challenges the League of Nations faced. The most important body in this system is the Security Council. The United States has exhibited one of the biggest challenges the UN faces, that of commitment. The U.S. has been a key player and funder from the start, but conservative elements in U.S. Congress have been hostile to the UN and certain programs, especially the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, as well as the International Criminal Court. Some have even introduced bills to remove the U.S. from the UN altogether. At other times, UN support has been important for legitimizing U.S. actions like Desert Storm in 1991 and the coalition of forces overthrowing the Taliban in 2003. But that support was lacking in the invasion of Iraq, but this did little to slow the United States. The primary concerns of the UN are to maintain peace, security, and order. This is reflected in a lot of the programs, which we will discuss briefly. Sovereignty is often a defense for states that wish to defy the international order in some way, but Lawson directs us to the lesson of Hobbes. For Hobbes, the purpose of the state was to safeguard life and limb, and once a state violates this clause, it has lost legitimacy. It has ceased to be a state that is truly sovereign, according to the reasoning presented. It is hard not to imagine a scenario where a state that behaves badly towards its own people generates a great many problems for the world order, creating large numbers of refugees, for example, or polluting air and oceans. These are not problems that stay at the borders of one state. The UN still functions largely on the principle of state sovereignty and preserving the state system. The norm of non-intervention is thus one of the prevailing norms of their behavior, but intervention is sometimes justified in extreme circumstances, and part of the UN's organization has been to address that question. There is also a solidarist bent to the UN's programs. There is certainly an attempt to build a new consensus around human rights that are not common practices in some regions, including the United States. But this attempt is also seen in the content of, as well as, large number of UN agencies and programs that exist to address these problems. This graphic portrays the general structure of the United Nations, the major organs within it, and their connections to each other, along with some other important programs and organs that report and prepare resolutions, which are agreements among countries within certain committees, and other important documents. The next slides give a bit more information about these major agencies and organs. The General Assembly is the analog to a parliament and a domestic government. This is where each country is represented and may vote on a number of issues brought before the body, where delegates from each country, usually the ambassador to the United Nations, but heads of government may also appear here. The body is comprised of all 193 member states who have the ability to vote. This excludes the states of Palestine and the Holy See. This is the main decision-making body of the United Nations. They require a 2/3 2/3 vote for important decisions and a simple majority for most others. The GA creates and passes budgets similarly to a legislature and monitors finances of the overall operations of the United Nations. The General Assembly also elects representatives to other standing committees, commissions, and councils. They create the agenda by considering and recommending actions or topics to these other committees and councils. They are also there to resolve disputes between countries or between agencies within the United Nations. In times of conflict, they may make recommendations for how to resolve the conflict between two countries, including providing the negotiating space and mediators to conduct negotiations between warring entities. They also review and consider reports from the Security Council and other United Nations organs in the event that further action needs to be taken. There are some special functions attached to the General Assembly. They are, under certain circumstances, allowed to address threats to peace in the event that the Security Council is not fulfilling its duties in this area. This provision is in the Charter of the UN, but has only been used a few times and not since the late 60s. The General Assembly also oversees the progress toward important benchmarks and goals in other committees, including political, economic, humanitarian, social, and legal initiatives like the Millennium Development Goals that stem from the World Summit Outcome document. One important issue relates to how the United Nations is funded. It generates most of its money for operations from state dues to the organization. The United Nations may revoke a country's right to vote if they fail to pay their dues more than 2 years in a row or file more than 2 years worth of arrears in payments. Some exceptions are allowed in times of financial distress. For example, in 2013, a handful of countries were allowed to vote in spite of being more than 2 years in debt to the UN. And in 2014, Yemen was allowed to vote as well. Today, everyone is able to vote. By the way, not only developing countries get in arrears, the U.S. has been in arrears up to $1.3 billion in spite of providing funding for various other programs in the UN. The Security Council is the only organ in the United Nations, aside from the General Assembly in rare circumstances, that has the power of enforcing the UN's decisions. There are 5 permanent members: the United States, China, Russia, France, and the UK, with 10 non-permanent members that rotate out every 2 years. The body exists for 4 purposes: maintaining peace and security, ensuring friendly relations between states, promoting human rights and cooperation on international problems, and harmonization of relevant policies like asylum, immigration, international crime prevention, etc. Decisions by the Security Council require 9 members voting in favor and none of the 5 permanent members vetoing. Any of the 5 may veto a resolution or other action. The first step the Security Council usually takes is to recommend parties to try to reach agreement by peaceful means. The idea is to bring hostilities to an end as soon as possible. But if these attempts at diplomacy fail, the Security Council may introduce economic sanctions against a country, or it may engage in peacekeeping missions or peace enforcement missions. The Charter of the UN only establishes the authority of the Security Council for peace enforcement, but peacekeeping has still been a big part of what the Security Council authorizes. The difference between enforcement and peacekeeping is that with peace enforcement missions, the Security Council only has to decide to intervene. With the peacekeeping missions, the government where the UN will be operating has to approve and accept the peacekeepers. In addition, there are restrictions about what UN peacekeepers are allowed to do. In most circumstances, they are not allowed to engage in armed combat unless in self-defense. This is not true of peace enforcement missions, which might include fighting against armed combatants in the hosting country. The Economic, Cultural, and Social Committee was established by the Charter in Articles 61 through 71. The committee is formed by 54 member states of the United Nations who are elected by the General Assembly to serve in 3-year overlapping terms. You can check the current membership at the website provided. The EcoSoc Council is tasked with addressing problems of poverty, development, the environment, malnutrition, disease, and other issues related to material and cultural well-being of peoples. And this slide really just contains some of the subsidiary programs that fall under the guidance of EcoSoc. The next body we talk about is the Secretariat, which is established in Articles 97 through 101 of the UN Charter and basically is the civil service arm of the United Nations. It is responsible for the day to day administrative operations, and it includes the Secretary General and the United Nations staff. The Secretary General is appointed by the General Assembly on the recommendation of the Security Council, as established in Article 97. The Secretariat must submit an annual report of its operations to the General Assembly. The current Secretary General is Antonio Guterres. The Trusteeship Council is more or less a defunct part of the United Nations. It was established to oversee the decolonization projects, and as it is established in Chapter 12 today, mostly what it does is provide an annual report on remaining trust territories, as there are no longer any legal colonies. The International Court of Justice is the United Nations dispute resolution body, and it hears disputes between states that agree to its jurisdiction. Being a party to some treaties automatically entitles the ICJ to preside over a dispute related to said treaty, and states acknowledge ICJ jurisdiction by signing these types of treaties. The ICJ ruling has the force of law, and states must abide by their rulings. As mentioned previously, the United Nations relies on membership dues and has no ability to tax its members. It also relies on voluntary contributions from states for extra funds and for soldiers, as it has no standing army of its own. Instead, various countries send troops on UN-supported missions. This graphic illustrates the biggest contributors to the UN's budget. As you see, the U.S. contributes the most at 22% of the budget, with China, Japan, and Germany trailing behind at 12%, 8.5%, and 6% respectively. Lawson writes about the role that civil society in a global sense has had on the United Nations, as well as the guiding principles that relate to humanitarian concerns. In general, when we discuss civil society institutions, we mean those that are not controlled by or related to government, but a type of association between individuals that is free and capable of producing the social ties needed to form and share like values. This is a concept in political science that is associated with strong democracies, so the attempt to discuss it at the level of international politics is sometimes hard conceptually. It is easier to understand social movements among people who share similar regions, lifestyles, and goals, but the truth is that social movements have been generating more and more global influence. The recent Black Lives Matter protests, for example, did not stay in the United States, and environmental and indigenous and anti-globalization protests have been going on since the late 1990s. In addition to these, non-governmental organizations like Amnesty International and Greenpeace have consultative status within the UN, and the UN and its agencies are often lobbied by these NGOs, non-governmental organizations, which are now seen as part of the global civil society. And that admittedly blurs the lines between the requirement for civil society to be outside of the sphere of government. But this is part of the general blurry lines that exist when we discuss how domestic and international politics affect each other. Sometimes the lines of influence are indirect or maybe even bidirectional. Movements that haven't stayed stateside that had enormous consequences include the Arab Spring, which spread from Tunisia in 2010 to Egypt, Libya, Yemen, and Syria, where entrenched rulers were experiencing their first real challenges to their rule in decades. This movement was one of the reasons the Syrian government attacked its own people, which had the effect of angering and mobilizing anti-government rebel forces who then began warring with the government. And the terrorist group ISIS was also given the perfect opportunity to attempt to take over while Syria was embroiled in social movement protest. These movements have been state-oriented but are also part of a broader democratization movement supported by various civil society groups as well as democratic governments. And this has had a global presence since well before the end of the Cold War. It can be argued even that the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union represented a very similar pattern of contagion of democratic movements. There is now a World Social Forum, which met for the first time in Brazil in 2001. This convenes on an annual basis and is a place for countries to democratically debate ideas about how groups in civil society can work for environmental and economic and democratic justice in their own societies. The article by Catherine Sekink discusses the ways that global civil society and human rights norms might work together to address human rights abuses. Beginning with efforts to establish a global consensus around human rights, we see the biggest effort in the UN Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. This contained 30 different articles that detailed human rights. It was not a binding treaty, but a set of principles that are still in effect today. Sekink asks, under what conditions do states accept these principles and norms, and what accounts for the wide variation in human rights observance around the world? The diffusion of international norms and principles happens, but existing research remains vague about what mechanisms or causal linkages exist to make them happen. The author discusses the 5-phase spiral model through which states adopt human rights norms. Importantly, stable institutions and the rule of law are important preconditions for states to accept human rights. Having the ability to put something into written law and have people follow the law is an important precondition for any legal issue. In addition, however, Sekink argues that issue advocacy networks, i.e., global civil society, has to be operating to bring awareness of human rights concerns to the public and the international community. In the first phase, human rights violations occur when states enact oppressive policies while domestic human rights organizations document and bring it to the international community. In phase 2, the norm violating state denies the accusations. In phase 3, governments attempt to curb human rights abuses through laws and may even incorporate international rights language into the process. In phase 4, the state begins to internalize and really adopt the norms and practices and human rights networks formed to keep civil society involved. And in phase 5, governments become more consistent in their behavior and institutionalize human rights norms, and it actually becomes state practice. This is really only one of the articles that addresses the World Human Rights Record and how violating states can change due to international influence. The main purpose of this discussion has been to envision how civil society and international organizations work together for the goals of global governance. One of the biggest issues outside of trade, which we will turn to shortly, relates to this question of human rights and when, what type, and how international influence is possible.